play the game of SOS, first, set up the game. To do this, first players will get a piece of paper and 2 writing utensils. If players only have a single writing utensil, they can also share it and pass it between each other. Next, players will set up the game grid. The game will be played on a square grid. For a shorter game, they can play with a grid of fewer boxes. For a longer game, they can play with a grid of more boxes. After setting up their grid, players will decide on their marker for the game. During the game, players will be creating combinations of SOS on the grid. After creating an SOS, they will have to mark it on the grid. One player will mark their combinations by circling them, and the other will mark their combinations with a strike through. If players choose, they can also play the game with different colored writing utensils. One player could use one colored pen, and the other could use a different colored pen. After setting up the game, players are ready to begin playing. The game of SOS is a 2-player letter placement game, where players are either placing an S or an O on the grid during their turn. Each player in the game is trying to create the most combinations of the letters SOS. To start the game, one player will be named as the start player. That player will choose any one square in the grid and place either the letter S or the letter O in their chosen square. After that player takes their turn, the next player will do the same, choosing any square in the grid and placing either an S or an O on the grid. Players will continue taking turns, placing either an S or an O in any square of the grid. The game of SOS can easily be modified to use a different 3-letter word. Players can use any 3-letter palindrome to play the game. So any 3-letter word that is spelled the same backwards and forwards will work for the game. If players decide to use a different word for the game, they will simply take turns placing one of those letters in one of the boxes. As players start to fill the grid, they will also start looking for combinations of the letters SOS. SOS can be created horizontally, vertically, or diagonally on the grid. If a player places a letter on their turn and creates the combination of letters SOS, they will immediately circle the letters to claim it as theirs. Anytime a player circles at least one combination of SOS during their turn, they will get to take another turn and place another S or O on the grid. So blue completed an SOS and would get to take another turn. On this turn, they place their O here and complete another SOS. They will circle it and get to take another turn. If they placed here, they would complete yet another SOS, circle it, and take another turn. While playing, it is possible for a player to miss the fact that the letter they just placed created an SOS. Players can decide how to handle this situation. Players can choose to play the game in a way that any missed SOS combinations will simply go unclaimed. So if this player placed their S here and missed the fact that they created an SOS here, that SOS would remain unclaimed in the game. Players can also choose to allow the other player to steal their missed SOS combinations. So if it was this player's turn and they missed the fact that they created an SOS here and ended their turn, on the next player's turn, they could steal this SOS combination that the other player created. If players are playing with this method, a player can find and circle any missed SOS that they or their opponent missed, anywhere on the grid. The only requirement is that they do it during their turn. If they play with these stealing rules, a steal will simply be a steal, so the player will not get an extra turn for stealing another player's SOS. They will only get another turn if they create an SOS with the letter they just placed. There are 2 distinct versions of the game of SOS. The first is a game with the goal of finding the most SOS combinations. The second is a game with the goal of finding the first SOS combination. In this version of the game, the first player to create an SOS on the grid will win the game. The game of SOS ends after the last box of the grid has been filled by a player. After the game ends, both players will count up all of the combinations of SOS that they found during the game. The player who made the most SOS combinations will be declared the winner. To play the game of four-letter word box, first, set up the game. To do this, each player will get a piece of paper and a writing utensil. Next, each player will draw a 4x4 grid on their paper. Each box must be large enough to fit a letter inside, but it can be small enough to fit several games on a single sheet of paper. After setting up the game, players are ready to begin playing. The game of four-letter word box is a game where players are creating their own grid of letters and then trying to create as many four-letter words as they can from those letters. The game can be played with 2 to 8 players. If players are playing with 3, 5, 6, or 7 players, they will have to make a modification to make sure the game remains fair. To do this, they will divide the total number of squares, which is 16, by the number of players. For example, in a 7-player game, players would divide 16 by 7. 7 goes into 16 2 times, so each player would get 2 turns. And there would be 2 squares left over that players would have to fill with a letter before starting the game. After players figure out how many letters they will need to fill in before the game starts, they will decide as a group which letters to use. So in a 7-player game, there are 2 extra spaces on the grid. So players will have to decide which 2 letters to pre-fill into the grid. They may choose any 2 letters, and the letters may either be the same letters or 2 different letters. After deciding on the letters, each player will decide where to place those letters on their individual grid. So each player's grid may look different. After placing their initial letters, they should keep their grid hidden. To start the game, one player will be named as the start player. That player will name any letter of the alphabet. They may choose any consonant, or they may choose any vowel. After a letter has been named, each player in the game will immediately write that letter on any space of their 4x4 grid. They must place the letter right after it was called out, so they may not wait to see what the next letter is before placing it. Each player should keep their grid hidden from all other players after writing their first letter on it. After the first letter has been called, the next player will call out the next letter. That player may call out the same letter as the previous player, or a new letter. Once again, each player will write that letter on any empty space of their grid and keep their grid hidden from other players. After that player names a letter, the next player will call out the next letter. Once again, each player will write that letter on any empty space of their grid. Players will continue naming letters until all 16 squares of each player's grid have been filled. After all players have filled their grid with letters, they will move into the next phase of the game, which is finding words on their grid. To do this, they will create as many unique 4-letter words as they can. They can do this horizontally, vertically, or diagonally. They can create words in a forward direction or backwards. But players must all agree that the word is a word, and proper nouns such as people's names are not allowed. As mentioned, the word they find must be unique. So if a player creates the same word twice on the grid, they will only count it once. They are, however, allowed to use the same letters to create 2 different words. For example, let's say this player was looking at these 4 letters. They can spell pots in a forward direction, and using the same letters, they can spell stop in a backward direction. If players would like to add more possibilities to the game, they can allow bent words. If players would like to add this variation, any unique 4-letter words will be counted, as long as their boxes are connected, horizontally, vertically, or diagonally. So if these rules were being used, this player could spell moat like this, and lure like this. The game ends after all players have finished finding four-letter words in their own grid. The player who found the most four-letter words in their grid will be the winner. To play the game of Balda, first, set up the game. To do this, first get a piece of paper and at least one writing utensil. Players in the game may either each have their own writing utensil, or they may share the same one. Next, one player will draw a 5x5 grid on the paper. They will also make an area on the side of the grid where they can keep player scores. After creating the grid and the scores sections, all players in the game will agree on any 5-letter word that they would like to use as the base word for the game. The agreed-upon word will be written in the middle row of the boxes of the grid. One letter of the word will go in each box, and the letters must remain in order of that word. So players could not mix the letters of their chosen word. After setting up the game, players are ready to begin playing. The game of Balda is a word-building game where players are trying to make words off of the main 5-letter starting word. The game plays best with 2 to 5 players. To start the game, one player will be named the start player. That player will begin by placing a letter of their choice on the grid. Their letter may be a letter that was already placed on the grid, or it may be a new letter. They will place their letter somewhere in the row above or below the starting word. After placing their letter, they will try to create one new word that includes the letter they just placed. So this player placed their L here to create the word louse. After the start player creates their word, they will score points for the word. To score a word, that player will score 1 point for each letter of the word they created. So this player created the word louse. There are 5 letters in the word they created, so this player will score 5 points. They will write the word they created and the score in the score section. After the start player takes their turn, the next player will choose the next letter to add to the grid. Once again, they may choose any letter. After they choose their letter, they will place it somewhere on the grid, connected to another letter by a side of the square. So the next player could place their letter in any of these spaces. After they place their letter, they will try to create a word with the new letter they just placed. So this player placed the B on the grid and could form a new word of blouse. They will score 1 point for each letter in the word they created. So this player would score 6 points. They would then write the word they created and the score in the score section. After that player takes a turn, the next player will take their turn, place the letter, and score points for any word they were able to create. Players will continue taking turns, placing one letter on the grid, and scoring points for the one word that they create. While creating words, there are a few rules that players must follow. The letter you place must be included in your word. So if this player placed their letter here, that letter would have to be a part of the word they created. Players are only allowed to score for one word on their turn. So if the letter they placed created multiple words, they would have to choose one to score. Players may not score the same word twice. So if players already created a word, another player could not score for the same word. They would have to create a different word. Players may not add an S to a word. This is mainly because it would make it far too easy to simply pluralize words to score several points. To create a word, that player must include letters that are connected, either vertically or horizontally. So players may not use letters that are connected diagonally. Letters of the grid may not be repeated while creating a word. So if this player added this letter to the grid, they could not repeat the letter in this square twice. They may not use a proper noun, such as the name of a specific person, a specific place, or a specific thing. If a player tries to use a word that the majority of players refuse to believe is actually a word, and that player cannot prove that it is a word, that word may not be used. It is possible for a player to place a letter and be unable to create a word using the letter they just placed. If this happens, that player will simply score 0 points on their turn. Players should keep in mind that they are allowed to score for 2-letter words, so most of the time they will be able to find something on the grid. The game will continue with players filling spaces in the grid and creating a word until all spaces have been filled. The game of Balda ends after all of the spaces of the grid have been filled. In a 3-player game, each player would take a total of 6 turns, and there would still be 2 spaces left over. Players will leave the last 2 spaces of the game unfilled. After the game ends, each player will complete their final scoring. To do this, each player will total up all of the points they scored for the words they created during the game. The player who ends the game with the most points will be the winner.